Okay, welcome back to another exciting episode of the Innate Radio Podcast. We got a live one with Dr. Jacob Torres.
All right.
And I'm Andrew Raza. We're coming to you here. Dr. Jacob's going to do a special presentation on metabolic health, flexibility, fasting, the latest research, and then some really simple, actionable takeaways. Hopefully you guys can take some notes. And then we'll challenge you. We've got the Power Habits program coming up. Not to write down 10 things and do none of them or try to do all of them at once and fail, but to write down 1, 2, or 3 things and then do your best to really implement one of them and make it part of your lifestyle. When appropriate, we'll get some context. And if you have any questions as they come up, please drop them in the chat box and we'll make sure those get answered. Please do not unmute yourselves, as this was just going to be like a straight presentation for 30 minutes is the plan. Yeah. And we'll do some Q&A afterwards. Ready, set, 3, 2, 1, go.
All right. Let me make it pretty behind me. So stare in the bedroom.
Beautiful.
All right. Well, so we talk a lot about metabolic health and metabolic flexibility on our podcast. And today I'm just going to go over some of the basics of, these principles and hopefully give some actionable stuff at the end. This is going to be more of a, generalized, say layman, but really anybody can understand this stuff. We're going to try to make some analogies to our everyday life and see if that makes it a little more sense. So here we go. Next technical challenge. Let's try to share a screen. Make sure that this, all right, we've got a screen share going. The question is, will the computer hold up? All right, here we go. So metabolic health and how to improve it. That's the idea here today. So let's go forward. So first, I just want to introduce everybody to the idea of metabolism. So just for the test, I want everybody to stare at this, and you're going to remember everything here for the test at the end of the lecture. Reason I put this up here is because when I think of metabolism, this is kind of what I'm imagining is these interconnected pathways. These are cellular pathways. These are the ways that we make energy, the ways that we make macromolecules, DNA, carbohydrates, proteins, all those things. So there's a lot going on. There's many interacting pathways and competing pathways. So this is kind of like the sum of metabolism inside the cell. But that's not all that makes up metabolism. There's a lot more to it than that. But I just wanted to kind of, just put this out here just because I think it's funny to kind of like stare at it because it is so complex. And this is one of the reasons why science is not super easy to always figure out because you have many things interacting with each other. But yeah, so anyway, moving on. So more kind of easy way to think about metabolism. It's the sum of all the reactions that are going on inside the body and all the individual cells. So we put things in, we get stuff, we kind of do stuff with the things that come in, and we end up with breakdown products. So we might put in things like water, oxygen's very important. We got to have food, and the food gives us chemical energy. Those come in the forms of protein, fats, carbohydrates. And then we have these cofactors, which are the vitamins and minerals that allow us to utilize all of those energy molecules. And then at the end, we expel carbon dioxide, or we sweat and we breathe out water. We expel urine and feces. And then importantly, we also produce heat. So that's what these outputs are. So we either use it, we get energy out, we make waste, or we make heat. Those are kind of our main outputs of metabolism. And so the sum of metabolism is all of the inputs and the outputs. So if we think about metabolism as an ideal system, that would be we put in everything that we get out. So that'd be 100% efficiency. But reality is that more like 10% of what we actually put in comes out, and the rest is lost as heat. And so just a simple, diagram here. So CHO just means a carbohydrate. Those can be turned into glucose. Fat can also be used for energy, but it does not turn into glucose. It's just oxidized into carbon dioxide and water, but the majority of the energy is lost as heat. That's like a big waste product from this breakdown of energy. And so this is what's really going on most of the time. We're breaking stuff down, we're making water heat. What's important here is that fat can be used for energy in the mitochondria and I'll kind of highlight what a mitochondria is if people are forgotten or never learn. And this is where oxygen is combined to make energy, and that's where the CO2 and water is produced. We can use glucose as well. Glucose can be used in the mitochondria, but it can also be used during high intensity exercise or sprinting, things that we have to move very quickly, and can bypass the mitochondria to produce energy. It's called anaerobic glycolysis, but also carbohydrate can be used in the mitochondria as well. So it can be either way. So that'll become important later on. So the next topic I just want to introduce is just the concept of health. Sounds straightforward, right? But health is actually, again, another form of, if you think about it as an ecosystem or metabolism. And this is defined as the system that has inputs and outputs. And the output is your health, your well-being. That's the overall system that you're managing. But it has all of these inputs, and these inputs are more than just the physical side. They have, the environmental, emotional, financial, spiritual, occupational, social factors. You have all of these different factors that go in to make who we are and what defines health. And so any disruption in any of these sectors can lead to many other problems in the system. And you can take this idea and you can expand it to other systems. So if you think about globally or ecologically, you can think about situations where you have like the water cycle that is produced from clouds, collects in rivers and streams, is then collected by plants and microbes, comes into the leaves of trees, and then is expelled as water again, and oxygen, carbon dioxide. So you can see all of these different interconnections and players, like the primary or secondary consumers. They are part of the cycle as well, because they feed the soil, they consume the products of the cycle, and everything is kind of in a state of flux all the time. And why it's really important is because a system that is at or below equilibrium cannot technically live. You cannot have a system where energy is not being consumed and products being made. There has to be excess energy. There has to be an increased production. Otherwise, it's not a system that is alive. Something at equilibrium is not alive. So if you have like anything that has no energy, it cannot sustain life. So that's kind of an important factor. Is we have to think about all these inputs and how they actually go into creating health and life. So in the concept of metabolic health, we're going to focus in on one particular aspect of the different arenas that produce health, and that one is the physical. So the physical is underpinned by cellular health. And the question, the factors that I mentioned previously, that affect cellular health are not always at the physical level. So we have the, emotional, environmental, social, spiritual level. All of these different things will affect our stress levels. They can affect these intangible aspects of our health, which in turn can affect the physical. So there is a connection always back to this physical aspect of health. So they do affect us, but in a different way. But ultimately, those are all regulated by cells. And if we can mitigate some of the stress factors or these other factors of what is these other areas of health, we can actually bolster or become more resistant to stress from these other factors, other arenas. And so the way we do that is we focus on some of these very specific areas of the physical health, which is one, mitochondrial health, another one is inflammation, and the other one is nutrient availability. So these are all kind of interconnected and intertwined. So if we focus on inflammation, we generally improve mitochondrial health. If we focus on nutrient availability, we generally improve inflammation and mitochondrial health. So they're very interconnected. So we just kind of focus on these things and see how those can actually work together. So there's another concept, metabolic efficiency. And so this is just this is kind of the way that we use energy, and so it's a way that we can use it in efficient or effective ways. And it might be familiar with the concept of how different macronutrients have different amounts of calories associated with them. So, a gram of carbohydrates is 4 calories, gram of proteins, 4 calories. Technically, it's a little less, it's about 3.4. A gram of fat is 9 calories, a gram of alcohol, 7 calories. So you can live on alcohol technically. You don't need to actually eat carbohydrates. The difference is between these materials is how they're actually consumed inside the cell. So depending on the macromolecule, you get more energy because of the way that it's actually being utilized. Things that affect these different densities are if you're not absorbing food. So if it's just passing through and you're not actually absorbing the nutrients, they're not going to have these 4 calories is not coming from a gram of carbohydrates. If you're just storing it, not using it. So if one eats a great deal of fat, but then that fat is just stored, that's actually not going to be getting 9 calories per gram. You're storing it, so it's not being used. And then there's efficiency at the cellular level, like how well are we using these substrates? So, are we using them for for their full potential? That's another question. So this leads into how metabolic health and immunity are connected, and there's going to be a lot of crossover between these different topics. And so I want to introduce this idea of immune function and inflammation. So metabolic health is directly related to immune function. And the reason this is because immune cells are regulated by inflammation. And inflammation is very clearly need to define inflammation, and people need to understand what it actually is. We talk a lot about it, and I don't always think that it's very clear what it is. But inflammation is a cellular process. It's a distinct state that the cell takes on in response to an injury. And generally, these injuries are acute. So an acute response is the role of inflammation to deal with an insult that comes from the environment. So trauma, infection, allergies, like these little things that we might encounter in our environment that lead to an acute response. Those should be resolved rapidly, on the order of days. That should be the time that we should be undergoing an acute inflammatory response. The problem comes is when these acute inflammations do not resolve, and you end up with what's called chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation, which many people are familiar with, is the kind of the source of all of the modern diseases we face. So cardiovascular disease, autoimmune, cancer, and so on. So this is real. This here, the acute inflammation is something that we should be very good at, and chronic inflammation should be non-existent for the most part. So how do we actually make this happen? So what inflammation looks like, just to get a little more understanding. So if you have, for instance, you get a splinter in your finger, we're very familiar with this inflammatory response where we have an injury, we pull the splinter out, and then we have swelling and pain and warmth, redness. This response is the cells in that area. So there's local cells that are near the injury that will release molecules that will make the area swell up and red and kind of fill up with fluid. And it also attracts a number of white blood cells. So here they're purple, but this attracts these white blood cells to come in and clean up damaged cells. And the inflammatory response is triggered by a number of different molecules, and one of them is dead or dying cells. So if a cell breaks open, a lot of the contents of the cell are what we call inflammatory mediators, and they are things like ATP, which is an energy molecule. It can be other macromolecules inside the cell that will cause local inflammation, and then that's what causes these white blood cells to kind of come along. Another kind of inflammation would be a chronic inflammation, or this can be in a acute area as well, but this is an interesting example of what we call leaky gut. So in the gut, the gut is technically outside the body. The alimentary canal is one long tube from the mouth to the anus, and inside that tube, we would consider it the outside of the body. And so there's bacteria, there's food particles, there's waste products. All of that stuff is inside the gut, and it should stay inside the gut, because if it gets into the body, we end up with an inflammatory response. And so one of the things that can happen with stress, under stress conditions, and why stress is so dangerous in the long runs, is it can actually cause permeability in the gut lining. There's a lot of a lot of reasons this happens, but there's this connection here. We have the vagal nerve and the gut lining are connected together. They actually are communicating back and forth the status of the epithelial barrier. So these cells here that are lining the gut are these epithelial cells, and their job is to maintain a barrier from stuff that is coming into the body. If they have a breakdown in the junctions in between the cells, things can come in and things can cause inflammation. But also another thing that can happen is that immune cells, they need to sometimes get their way into the gut to remove certain materials that can't be broken down. So this is something that happens with gluten intolerance or wheat sensitivities, where you need to have immune cells infiltrate into the gut, and that opens up these barriers. It weakens the barrier, and then the infiltration of waste products or bacteria or food or whatnot can get in, and then those are where people develop allergies and all sorts of other autoimmune diseases. So this barrier integrity is very, very important for maintaining the health of the body, because it is a way to reduce inflammation globally. And if this barrier is permeable, then it leads to lots of chronic diseases, and there's a direct connection to the brain. So the brain can be affected, and this is where mood disorders and neuroinflammation, depression, all of these other diseases we're very familiar with, they kind of stem from this permeability in the gut. So a lot of stuff that is brain disease is actually related to the gut. So that's why I wanted to point out this specific example. So this is another example of chronic inflammation. So what can we do? So, preventing chronic inflammation, supporting metabolic health, and, getting these and having effective strategies for preventing disease. There's a lot of diseases that are, caused by inflammation. And, this is why this is such an important topic, is that if you look at just this list here, cardiovascular disease is the #1 killer in America. Followed up by, we have cancer, and then Alzheimer's disease. So those are our top 3. And then we have diabetes, or we have accidents, and then diabetes coming in behind that. These are huge problems, right? And I think anybody who's had experienced any of these diseases in person or in their family knows that these are just terrible things to have to deal with. But they're highly preventable. It's not always easy to do, but they are preventable. And, as long as things haven't gone too far down the road, they can be kind of turned around. But yeah, some of these, like Alzheimer's disease, once they're kind of starting to show the signs of dementia, it's very late. So these things need to kind of be nipped really early in order to prevent some of the later stage effects. So inflammation. So the reason inflammation is problematic is that it changes the way that cells behave. So it changes their metabolism, and specifically one of the things it changes is it shifts cells from using fat or being oxidative, so they use oxygen to make energy, towards making glucose. And there's a number of reasons for this. It's complicated, but there's a lot of interesting stuff out there of why this is actually happening. But I'm trying to give a good example of not being too complicated, but there's a good example of this is in cancer. So cancer cells, one of the things that they frequently do is they undergo something called a epithelial to mesenchymal transition. So this is called the EMT. And EMT means that the cells lose their normal cell type. So whatever they are, then they shift into this kind of semi-stem cell weird thing. But one of the things they do is they change their metabolism to being glucose dependent rather than oxidative, and that's called the Warburg effect. And this is kind of a very classical example of metabolism shift, and this was observed back in the early 1900s that this was happening. And this is one of the reasons why interventions like the ketogenic diet are very successful in some forms of cancer. But this is kind of a part of what the inflammatory response does is it changes the cells and their behavior, because when they're injured, they cannot do their normal functions because they're expecting danger, so they have to kind of guard themselves. So that's a way to think about it, is it's a inflammation guards cells so that they're prepared for danger and prepared for viral infection or bacterial infection. But in the chronic case where it does not get resolved, it leads to a lot of dysfunction, and this dysfunction is where where disease comes from. And things that trigger chronic inflammation in this context are things like stress, physical or perceived, doesn't have to be real or an actual thing that's happening. It can be something that we just think is going to happen. It can be dietary choices, sleep deprivation, chronic infections, nutrient deficiencies, environmental toxins. So these are all things that are very much under our control. So we should focus on the things that we actually can do the most about. So all of these things kind of lead our cells into this glucose dependent state and away from using fatty acid oxidation. And that seems to be a problem. And I think I'll kind of get to why that's a problem. So like I mentioned, a lot of these factors that trigger inflammation are completely preventable. And so I'll just give you a quick rundown of the things that will improve all of these inflammatory triggers. Sleep is a reason I put that the biggest one, is because it is the #1 way to reduce inflammation. So our bodies repair and regenerate when we sleep. The next one that's probably the easiest to do is just avoid inflammatory foods. So this is things like processed seed oils, sugar, alcohol, refined carbohydrates and foods, preservatives, and foods that we're allergic to. So if we're allergic to something, we shouldn't eat it, even if it tastes good. So I think that's something we should kind of stick to, because that leads to gut permeability and to the the factors that I mentioned earlier. Environmental toxins is something that we can avoid to an extent. If we live in a city, we're going to be exposed to things like heavy metals and lead, pesticides. These are just in the environment in general, so it's very challenging to avoid them. But there are things that we can avoid in our homes. We can avoid excess use of plastics that we eat out of. We can not use things that are like Teflon coated pans. There's all sorts of other little things that might be leaching environmental toxins into our body that we might not even notice. So certain shampoos and creams and things like that. So we just be careful about what we're putting on or in our body. And eating lots of micronutrients. So from whole foods, this is like why eating vegetables is so valuable. It provides a good source of micronutrients, and it can also influence our gut microbiome hopefully positively, and that can lead to reduced inflammation.
Read it.
Hold on one second. There we go. Okay. So sunlight is another big one. Sunlight modulates our inflammatory response in a number of ways, including vitamin D synthesis. And then this other regime here, eating less or less often, that's the realm of intermittent fasting, time-restricted feeding. Those are other ways to mitigate inflammation. It's interesting to point out that every time we eat food, we're consuming quite a bit of bacteria, and that bacteria can actually lead to an inflammatory response every time we eat. And it's not like it's a necessarily totally bad thing. It's just that we have a lot of bacteria in our mouth. We eat it, we chew it up, it goes into our stomach or into our duodenum technically, and that's where it's emulsified, and we pick up some of the bacteria in our body, and we get an inflammatory response from the bacteria. So when we don't eat, we're reducing those kind of like little boosts in inflammation over time. And so that's one of the reasons why the eating less and less often is beneficial, because you get a little break from being inflamed. So the next topic I want to introduce is metabolic flexibility. So metabolic flexibility is the ability to use different energy substrates. So if you can use carbohydrates, you use carbohydrates. If you have fat around, use fat. And it's this idea is, you know, that we should be very good at whatever we put in our body at using it. If we're not good at using fat, that's a problem. If we're only good at using carbohydrates, that's also a problem. So we want to make sure that we're able to kind of, you know, feed ourselves and use whatever goes in as effectively and efficiently as we can. So what we would like to do is, you know, eat nutrients that match what we're trying to do. So if we're going to do an intensive workout, we would use carbohydrates before we exercise. If we're going to do an endurance workout, we would use more fat to fuel that endurance-based exercise. And when we eat nutrients that are not matched for the context, that's a form of stress. An example of this would be training fasted and doing high intensity exercise, or using carbohydrate to fuel endurance work like sprinting, or sorry, like low intensive exercise that's like jogging. So those are examples of mismatched fuel. So the reason this is important is because this is getting into mitochondrial health. So we really want to have flexibility because that is the sign of metabolic health. And metabolic health really is underpinned by mitochondrial health. And so if everybody remembers from science class, here's a cartoon picture of a cell, all the different organelles, they call them, the little components of the cell. But the one that we're really interested in here is the little guy down there at the corner called the mitochondrion. So the mitochondria, that's the place where fat is utilized for energy, where we use oxygen to make energy. So if we only are good at using carbohydrates, we'll kind of deprive the mitochondrion of energy. If we are using fats, we're preferentially, it has to go through the mitochondria if we're using it for energy. So we really have to supply fatty acids in order to keep the mitochondria happy and healthy. All right, so that was a lot of different stuff there. So, and I'll get into a little more practice stuff, but here are the big goals. So decrease inflammation, improve mitochondrial health, improving cardiovascular health, and mobility. We didn't get to the movement part yet, but these are the things that are really going to go the farthest for just health in general, and they're all interconnected. If you decrease inflammation, you're probably going to move better, so your mobility is going to be better. You're going to want to move more. If you move more, your cardiovascular health will improve, your mitochondrial health will improve, and you'll decrease inflammation, and so on. So they all kind of have interconnected pieces. And to put this acronym in here for SMART, so just a way to make a goal, be specific, make it measurable, make sure it's attainable, it's relevant, and then there's some time you're going to do it in. So pick a time that you can get it done. So this is kind of the be smart, pick your goals and be smart. So the first one I'm going to go over is decreasing inflammation. So the easiest one is identify where inflammation is coming from in your life. So if you're sitting like this all day, or you're eating inflammatory foods, those are all going to be problematic. Those are things that are, huge sources of inflammation. So if we're sitting all day, and like this guy, if you're crouched over a computer with a hunchback, that's a huge signal to the body that things are not going well, and that's a source of inflammation. If we're not sleeping well, that's a source of inflammation. If we're not moving and we are moving poorly, so this example here is a poor movement pattern, improved movement practice of just sitting and leaning to one side, getting your hips all messed up, whatever it might be. Those are all things that are going to lead to inflammation. And if we're staying inside all day and not getting sunlight, these are all like the easiest, these are the low-hanging fruit. Whilst I would argue that sleep and stress are going to be probably the ones that are the most difficult, even though these are the low-hanging fruit, those are the most difficult to modulate. Sleep, while having the biggest effect, is generally the hardest to change, just because staying awake is so much better than sleeping. But if you can find a way to increase the quality of sleep, even if quantity doesn't necessarily go up at the beginning, quality is very important. And so just getting good quality sleep can make big differences before you improve quantity. I think that the easiest here is probably going out in the sun, getting outside and just, getting sun in the early morning, spending, 15, 20 minutes in the sun during the day, in the midday when the sun is the brightest. That's going to be probably one of the easiest things to do because it requires zero activity, but you do have to go outside and there does have to be sun. So that can be tough in the winter. But then after that, I think removing inflammatory foods, these are, I think we all know by now which ones are the good ones and which ones are not good, but it does take a little bit more work just to make sure we're not doing those things. So the next part, improving mitochondrial health, I put this yummy plate of food here. These are all things that are beneficial for mitochondrial health. I know we have lots of different spices, we have antioxidants, many different compounds and minerals within inside of fruits, and these, you see lots of vibrant colors. Those are generally lots of polyphenols, antioxidants. These are all things that mitochondria are very happy to have lots of because they use them frequently. You also have omega-3 fatty acids. So these are things like they come in fish. So increasing fat in the diet's a big one. Removing antibiotics can be that's really helpful for mitochondria since they are basically bacteria. We can also improve our mitochondrial health by simultaneously addressing cardiovascular health by just brisk walking and using nostril breaths, because that is a sign of decreased stress. And so eating healthy fats, and specifically omega-3 monounsaturated fats, these are the ones that are found in fish and mostly cold water fish. That's probably going to be the biggest source of them. So these are things that are, going to be pretty good for you if you're able to, add these things into the diet, they're going to go a long way. And another thing that affects mitochondrial health is fasting and time-restricted feeding. This is, something that is not, I wouldn't say this is the holy grail or this is the thing that everybody should be going to do right away, because fasting is a form of stress. You would address the underlying issues, the big ones first before adding in the fasting and the time-restricted feeding. Fasting, just to make sure to clarify the difference, is a period of time without food, so no calories coming in. That would be, any period of time. Usually we're talking 24 hours or more. That's a fasting period. Time restricted feeding, on the other hand, is a restricted eating window. So generally people do a 16-hour fast, 8-hour feeding window during the day, every single day, and they maintain that same window day after day. That is a much easier and non-stressful way to eat. If you're picking a time, in the morning that you start eating and then you finish around 5 or 6, that's like a pretty good, schedule. It can be challenging because of, people have lives they want to get to, but if you're able to maintain this 4 to 5 days a week, that's shown a lot of benefits in a lot of different studies. So that one's probably the place I would kind of, try to stick with the most. Fasting you add in once you have some stress reduction. So the other big one, improving sleep. So just improving sleep, and these are the different ways to do it. So find a way to get more sleep, however you can. Either nap or go to bed early. Remove caffeine or other stimulants in the day, or completely. I know that one's really tough. I think, a lot of people enjoy the ritual of coffee and caffeine. The thing is, if you're on a tough day where you've had a poor sleep, caffeine is not going to make it better. It's going to make things much worse in the long run. So you really have to be attentive to your response to caffeine and your stimulant. Be really honest about how much stimulants actually are taking in. People sometimes find that they're drinking multiple cups of coffee a day. That's, and they're wondering why they are not losing weight or not being able to add on muscle or just performing poorly in the gym. Those are all, sleep is definitely going to make a big difference, or the caffeine makes a big difference in sleep there. Sleeping in complete darkness. This means just having a blackout curtain, making sure that there's no light coming into the room. Our brains are very sensitive to light, some people more than others, but it's, just buying some blackout curtains, sleeping in the dark, making sure it's nice and cool will help go a long way. avoiding blue light. I think this is pretty straightforward. Just no computer monitors or cell phones or TV. But that's, again, another tough one. Some people are kind of don't respond the same to the blue light, but it's, kind of experiment, see what works. And then avoid eating late at night or a few hours before bed, because this too can kind of keep the body kind of in a digestive state, which is more active, and also large amounts of protein can heat up the body, so it makes it harder to sleep. The other area here would be to improve movement. So, not just movement in general, like quantity, but also quality. And that means, if we're going to the gym and doing a Fran workout, like doing CrossFit and getting beat up, that's not going to count, because that's going to be that's not quality movement. That is, increasing the stress levels in the body. Depending on how well you recover, that might not be a realistic way to exercise, but improving just the way we move. So going for, hikes or walks, or doing yoga, doing things that are a little lower impact can go a long way. Doesn't mean to avoid the high intensity stuff. It just means you have to be well prepared for it. So doing a lot of accessory work and then using the high intensity stuff is kind of a way to improve fitness and, test yourself, but not to use it, when you're not fully prepared. So I think that's really the big difference there, is the quality. So I really want to emphasize that again. Quality is what's important. Quantity, I would say low impact quantity, but also high quality. So adding in resistance training, this can be in the form of, barbells or dumbbells, calisthenics. Those are all valuable options. And then, get a coach, get somebody that, if you need help with any of this stuff or want to know how to improve, coaching is always a great option. Gets some accountability, gets people, gets them excited, and make a plan. So I think that's a really good reason to have a coach. And another pair of eyes is great to have. And so finally, after all that, just keep on figuring out how to make it happen. So keep doing it. You can do it. You just got to make these small improvements one at a time. And it's good to kind of find a way to keep improving and keep up momentum. So, taking stuff away is not the way I would necessarily do it. I would always add things before I take away. I would also always have a community and friends, somebody that's, that's why another reason a coach is valuable, because somebody that's going to give support, kind of give some guidance. And, there's always some good things that happen with accountability. And, don't just take things away. So if it's, if you look around your house and you find, everything is inflammatory in my cupboard, I don't know what I'm going to do. I have to throw all my food away. It's try going and buying some vegetables and eating those instead of, throwing everything away first. Just think about how you can add in positive activities, or, ways to increase your health through additives rather than taking away. I think that's a good way to start, and then start weaning off of the things that maybe are causing problems. So finding those things that don't work and get rid of them. And so create sustainable goals. Don't do anything that you think you can't live up to. I think that's that's a good way to fail. It's good to be ambitious, set big goals. The BHAGs, the big audacious hairy goals, as Lauren would say. Those are, I think, good to have, but make sure that's something that you can stick to. It's not something that if you think that you're getting deprived of something, then it's going to be tough to change things. And with that, I think that's all I got for now. So I'll stop the share. And if anybody has any questions, we can go ahead and talk about that now.
Thanks, Dr. Jacob. That was an awesome, information-packed presentation. I know Corey asked, what are some ways to maintain a healthy gut lining? I think he asked this before you got to that slide, but I think it's worth talking about. I know it's something I struggle with. And I would, I've heard many of these things several times before, and it's just like really nice to get that repetition in, get those reps in, because it's really, I find it easy to forget, and it's easy to get distracted by all the marketing claims or all the hype and the latest fad, but really it comes down to, like you said, decreasing inflammation, internal and external, in all aspects of your life, and adding in those positives, those positive nutrients, whether they be food or movement or sleep. Yeah, one thing I wasn't thinking about was stress. Like just being stressed out, you're saying, can affect gut permeability.
Yeah, I think that's one of the craziest parts of this story is that, our perceived stress, our the stuff that's coming in from our work or our anxiety, those are just as bad as eating poorly. They're all going to cause very similar effects. It's
Yeah,
very interesting.
it's tough as human beings. We can't just turn it off necessarily, and we get fired up about some guy in traffic or um whatever else is going on, and we could just ride that until we die or until we get one of these chronic diseases or whatever. It's crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we didn't talk about, or I didn't mention, mindfulness practices, but that's another good way to kind of help with the stress reduction. Mindfulness, meditation. I mean, those are very lacking in our society. I mean, I'm sure if we had those as tools, we would be a lot better off with managing a lot of our, emotional and societal stresses.
Yeah, agreed. This is a good plug for the Healthy Happy Power Habits program starting this coming Monday. I think myself definitely, I get fired up on a talk like this and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm going to stop eating. I'm going to start sleeping. I'm going to up the goals, down the inflammation. And before I know it, I'm kind of back to whatever habits I've had the past several years. So like you mentioned, having a coach, you'll get a coach, having the community, and getting some encouragement to start small and really lock that new behavior in before you get excited and try to layer everything at once.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. And then we got another question from iPhone. Any good strategies or mantras to keep up with the 8-hour intermittent fasting? I don't seem to be able to stick with it past a few days.
That's a good one. Well, I've encountered this, because we do experimental stuff, right? So we talk to a lot of people that are, when you're going to do this for, in the general population, when we talk to doctors, they say this is the hardest, dietary intervention is the hardest for people to do. Intermittent fasting, the reason it's tricky, to beginning is because it's usually that, if somebody has never done any form of time restricted feeding or intermittent fasting, the body is not designed or has not been adapted to using fat for energy. I think that's one of the biggest hurdles that people encounter. So the point of the fasting or time restricted feeding window is that they're trying to increase the ability of the body to be able to use fatty acids, right?
Yeah.
So early on, that adaptation is not there. So people are going to have a tough time with, with actually sticking to it, because hunger comes on outside of that window, and then that's really tricky. So one way around it is to, doesn't have to be 8 hours. It can be 10 hours. I think, there's way you can start with 12 hours. You just pick a time, start with the 12-12, and then you work your way down. So you do a week or 5 days, however long. You pick a goal, pick a number that you're going to stick with, and then you do 12-12, and then that's your starting position. Okay, so you do that for a week or more, and then once you feel comfortable with that, you step it down to 11 hours and so on until you get to an 8 to 10 hour window. 10 hours is kind of where you'd want to live in that range. 8 hours is fine as well, but you also can pick the 8 hours or 10 hours that fits your schedule the best and what people feel comfortable with. A lot of people, they can't do well because they like to eat after 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock at night. So then don't pick a time where you're not going to be able to do that. Make it easy on yourself. Like eat your first meal at 10 a.m., eat your last meal at 8, by 8 a.m. Seems reasonable. I mean, that's like a reasonable window. And you can kind of, once you stick to that for a while, that's just where you just kind of, figure out what that looks like. But yeah, it's at the beginning, it's a habit. So it's not always easy to start off at the 8 hours. You don't want to jump right in, make it manageable. Start with a longer window.
Nice. I was gonna say I've been doing more time restricted feeding since we've started our podcast, and it's not always easy. Like, I'll do it if I'm well slept and like stress is even, and I'll do it for a couple days. But if like I haven't slept at all or I'm having a hard time with life, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna eat today, and that's okay. So yeah, I think it really does work to like step down approach, and then if it is really hard, you probably need to back off a little bit and work your way up slowly.
Yeah, that would be my suggestion.
Cool. And then just another point here, I think we will hear lots of things like this out there as well. Examples of, I think, inflammation reducing foods.
And so anti-inflammatory
Anti-inflammatory, yeah.
foods.
Yeah,
I think that's there's different ways to look at that question. So one is there's actual anti-inflammatories, so medications or substances that will interfere with the inflammatory response. And these are, classically COX-2 inhibitors. So these are like the Tylenol, aspirin, acetaminophen, that kind of stuff. So those are, that's one way you can be anti-inflammatory. So there are things out there. So there's like, curcumin is an anti-inflammatory compound, and that's what it's in cumin. It's in it's in like you're gonna like curries and things. It's why is it my blank? Not curcumin. Yeah, cumin is the spice. Curcumin is the compound that's anti-inflammatory in the spice.
that's in turmeric.
Yeah, turmeric, exactly. So it's like what makes it so orange. But anyway, that is an anti-inflammatory food. But eating that is just kind of a way to reduce inflammation. It's not like going to remove the source of inflammation, but it is a useful tool for, like, say you get you're having some strong inflammatory response, like you have arthritis or a chronic inflammation, that can help kind of lessen some of the symptoms of it and get you back into balance. So they do have a place. They're helpful. Like when I had my hip surgery, I'd take some turmeric, like turmeric tea. You like mix it with milk. It's like a very, like a fatty drink because it's a fat absorbable. And then you take that and it helps with some of the inflammation with where I had the surgery. So stuff like that, it's, those are anti-inflammatories. But when it comes to just anti-inflammatory food, you want to add in things like Brussels sprouts and, lots of cruciferous vegetables. They have like probably some of the bigger anti-inflammatory properties because they have some stuff in there that's anti-inflammatory. But vegetables in general, they help with gut motility. They also have fermentable carbohydrates, which help with the lining of the gut. So this is that helps with feeding some of those epithelial cells in the gut and increases the gut integrity, the barrier integrity. So that kind of answer, I think Corey had that question earlier about gut health, and that's why fermentable carbohydrates, or what they call prebiotics, those are things that help with keeping the gut lining strong. So there's that's generally coming from butyrate. So butyrate's like a short chain fatty acid, and that comes from when we eat lots of little carbohydrates that we can't digest. They turn into butyrate.
Gotcha. Also, you mentioned healthy fats. I know that's a big key for keeping inflammation low, and then avoiding. I think you probably have more success avoiding inflammatory foods than you would adding anti-inflammatory foods on top of.
Right. Yeah. The removal and avoidance is going to go a lot further than the adding, because it's putting a fire out. It's easier to remove don't put more wood on it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like you get that's like one of the problems is if you still have like something around that is causing a lot of inflammation. If you keep eating it and you're trying to get around that, it's not gonna work. It just doesn't. The body is too clever. It's just gonna keep the inflammation on.
Yeah. And it's a bit of a catch-22 because I think we all, maybe with the best intentions, try to remove these inflammatory foods that maybe we crave or that we value, and then life gets stressful and they found their way back in. So it would be, like you mentioned, like additive, like maybe you focus on sleep for a while, maybe focus on getting nutrients, and then you find those cravings reduce. You find it easier to let go of gluten for a while or whatever you think might be the culprit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the way to go.
Awesome. We could definitely go all night, but yeah, again, I just want to challenge you guys to, you got it, Kathy. Challenge you guys to take not too many takeaways, but one that really jumped out at you, one that you think would be very valuable, and work on making that a habit, work on making that a part of your life. Oh, one question I had that just jumped out. Assessments and like those measurable goals you were talking about, like having metrics. What would be some good sort of blood panels that we could go to our doctors and say, hey, I'm determined to improve my metabolic health. What's my starting point right now? Let's take a look at where I'm at.
Yeah, so the big one's called the HOMA-IR score. It's a measurement of insulin resistance. It takes into multiple factors like fasting blood sugar and lipid profiles, and then that tells you like a score, and then the score is like how insulin resistant are you. And insulin resistance is generally related to inflammatory status. So the less insulin resistant you are, the less inflammation you have. So that's one big one that we can track for the long run and see how that improves. There's also the lipid panels, and so the lipid panel you would want is the NMR lipid panel that gives you particle size, particle count, and kind of breaks up the different densities of the particles. Then another one would be C-reactive protein, which is just if you suspect that you have chronic inflammation, you have some of the signs like rheumatoid arthritis or things that are not healing well, or you're not, or skin stuff. That's can be CRP. So that's called C-reactive protein. That's another one that says if there's a lot of inflammation going on. And then the A1C is the glycated hemoglobin score. That one just says how the blood sugar has been over the past several months or several weeks. And that one's helpful to just see like the overall blood sugar level, because again, blood sugar is related to insulin sensitivity. So those are
Awesome.
those are the big ones I think that are the most easy to track, and then you can keep, they can, if they improve, then it's you can, you're doing the right things.
Love it. That's great. That's going to be one of the challenges for this program, is to get your blood work done.
Oh, Kathy, drink as much water or non-caloric things as you want. So it can be tea or coffee. Those are all fine.
What about artificial sweeteners like a Diet Coke?
I would not venture into that world.
You get too many question marks.
Well, just artificial sweeteners are a source of, they can be sources of inflammation because they can affect the gut bacteria and gut health.
Gotcha. I wanted to, I think also our society at least can get confused or get confused about like, hey, I'm at a healthy weight, quote unquote. I'm not overweight. I don't look inflamed, basically. Like, therefore, I have nothing to worry about. But like, genetically, we don't really know what's going on under the hood, so to speak. How your cells are metabolizing fats or carbohydrates and all that. So the blood work really does come into important play.
Yeah, I think that the biggest things we can check on are skin. Like if your elbows or knees, face, you get these, you're getting dry eczema, things like that. Those are all signs that stuff's not working well. So usually those are dietary related though. So that's kind of the first signs that something's happening, is that there gets kind of skin problems before you get any other internal stuff. But that's a good marker that if you think that you're getting something going on.
Cool. Love it. If anybody else has any last minute questions, please drop them here in the chat box. If not, thanks again, Dr. Jacob. This is super informative. We hope it inspires anti-inflammatory action. We got the Innate Radio podcast. We would love for you guys to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Download. You can support us on Patreon. We do this to provide value for you guys, and if you love it, you can support us there on Patreon, Innate Radio. Share it with a friend, all that good stuff. But we really appreciate you guys coming on and sharing your Wednesday night with us. There will be more talks like this the coming weeks during the challenge, and we're not going anywhere. What are we, 90 episodes in here? Something
92? Like 93?
Okay.
We're going to have to do the 100 episode spectacular.
Bonanza, yeah. Awesome. So stay tuned, you guys. Thanks again, and hit us up with your emails, questions, texts, all that stuff, and we'll get to them when we can. All right. Have a good night, everybody.
Yeah, good night, everyone.
To your metabolic flexibility. Bye-bye.
Bye.